Okay, so what I'd like to do today is just do a few lines from this very long piece in the Biurim. We were dealing with this halacha called ha'osek b'mitzvah, pater min mitzvah. That if a person is engaged in one mitzvah, he's exempt from other mitzvot. And that's why we had said that if you're involved in taking care of the Aveda that is in your possession, that you can exempt yourself from going to attend to someone at the door who is asking for tzedakah. And it's on that basis that a person has a higher level of responsibility when watching an item, because in certain respects he may be considered to be like a shomer sachar. Now, as far as the halacha is concerned, the Imrei Yaakov brings in the Likutim that we end up as a suffix, whether you have a status of a shomer chinam or a shomer sachar when you're watching an aveda. It's unclear lahalacha whether a person watching an aveda has a higher level of responsibility or a lower level of responsibility. A higher level of responsibility, if you were considered to be a shomer sachar, a paid guard, then your obligation would extend to, even if, let's say, the object was stolen or lost, if Fluffy jumped out of the window and ran away, then you would be responsible for that. If, however, you only have the status of a shomer chinam, then if Fluffy is stolen or lost, so then you would not be liable for that aveda. So because it's a suffix, we would not be able to extract money on that basis from a person who was doing the mitzvah of watching someone else's aveda and it got stolen or lost. But it's largely academic when we discuss whether the status of a shomer aveda is a shomer chinam or a shomer sachar. But the interesting thing to discuss is the idea that a person is patur from observing mitzvahs when they're engaged in another mitzvah. Now, there's a long discussion on this issue. There are a lot of different permutations, and we're not going to go into the whole thing. But I just thought we'd do the first few lines of this idea, because he quotes here the Mishnah Berurah in the laws of Pesach as well, where the Mishnah Berurah brings up this issue of osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. He quotes the Mishnah Berurah as follows: Kasav Mishnah Berurah simin taf ayin hey sharat siyun sifkat lamed tes b'zel shana shomer aveda o mishamer ames. That if a person is watching a lost item, or let's say a person is doing shmira on a mace. Let's say he works, he's decided to volunteer his time, or he works at a funeral home, and he's watching someone who's in the funeral home, and it's the night of the Seder. Aftuhu gam kein potter az mikol ha-mitzvos. So at this point, he's exempt from all mitzvahs. Afilu yochel l'kayim shnehem im tzorach litroach acher zeladas kama poskim l'chleil b'simen lamed ches ayin sham. What we had seen from the Bir Halacha and Siman Lamed Ches and the laws of Tefillin is that even if it's technically possible to fulfill both, but if it involves additional burden, we exempt you nonetheless. Im ochel matzah azayatza yedei chovaso. He says, if, let's say, while you're doing your shmira at the funeral home, and it's at the night of Pesach, you go ahead and eat matzah with the acknowledgement that you're exempt, but you go ahead and eat it anyway. Okay, so dehu ish, he says, because after all, you're a man, meaning that you've done the act, you've physically performed the mitzvah, so you get credit for doing the mitzvah. In other words, you're still a human being who is capable of doing mitzvahs, but the Torah exempts you because you're engaged in another mitzvah. But that doesn't mean that just because you're exempt, it doesn't mean that you don't fulfill a mitzvah. It's true in any situation where a person is exempt. Let's say a woman is exempt from sitting in the sukkah. If she sits in the sukkah nonetheless, does she still get the mitzvah? Yes. So here too, you're exempt from eating matzah, but if you go ahead and eat matzah nonetheless, you are still fulfilling the mitzvah. Umikol makom mistapakna im yuchal az levarich birkas achilas matzah asher kedishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu v'chulei kevin shuhu az mitzuba al zeh arkad l'shono. But my doubt is, says the Mishnah Berurah, my doubt is, can a person make the bracha of asher kedishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu, that God, you commanded us to do this because I acknowledge that at this moment I am patur from the mitzvah. Okay? So it sounds a little bit bizarre, because does a woman, when she's exempt from sitting in the sukkah, does she still make the bracha of asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu? So the consensus of the poskim is that she does make the bracha, even though she was not commanded, because it's a mitzvah saseh shazman grama, that it is a time-related mitzvah, and therefore women are exempt from time-bound positive commandments. Nonetheless, she can still put herself in the category of Klal Yisrael and say that you commanded us, meaning the Jewish people, to do this mitzvah, and therefore she can make the bracha. But the Mishnah Berurah feels that since this particular individual is excluded from the mitzvah because he's doing another mitzvah, the Mishnah Berurah is not 100% sure whether he's still capable of making the bracha. And he doesn't really elaborate on that issue at all. So that's the end of the quote from the Mishnah Berurah. Now, he says, V'hinei ma depshitale de'etzem hamitzvah yatsa yedei chovaso afshu pater mimena. So the Imrei Yaakov just elaborates just a little bit. He says, what the Mishnah Berurah takes as a given, that you still fulfill a mitzvah even though you're exempt from it, matzinu ke'ein zeh v'chidush yeser b'shailos utshuvas panim me'iros chelik beis simin kuf mem zayin. Umuva b'pischei tshuva yoredei simin shin mem aleph sekatni yates. We see a tshuva, a responsum from the Sefer Panim Me'iros, which is quoted in the Pischei Tshuva. The Pasak Sham Lamaisa, he paskins there as follows: Da onein shelo haya yodeya hadin v'hivdil b'motzoi Shabbos. A person is an onein. So what is an onein? An onein is a person who has to take care of the burial of a recently deceased relative, and it's before the burial. And so he's patur from all mitzvahs, from all positive commandments, because the rabbis basically said, do nothing that would in any way distract you or delay you from taking care of the burial. And so therefore, you probably all are familiar with this halacha to one degree or another, that an onein is not allowed to make brachos, he's not allowed to daven, he's not allowed to do anything because any positive commandment, because he's got to take care of the needs of the deceased. Now, this does not include Shabbos, by the way. So, let's say it's over Shabbos and the burial hasn't taken place yet. Since he's not physically capable of taking care of the needs of the decedent because it's Shabbos and you can't make any plans, right? There's nothing practical to do because it's Shabbos. So therefore you revert back to your normal status and you can make Kiddush and so forth. But let's say it's the moment after Shabbos, person, God forbid, passed away on Shabbos, and now his son has to take care of all of the needs of the burial right after Shabbos, so he can't make Havdalah. He's patur from the mitzvah of Havdalah. Okay, and if let's assume the burial will take place on Sunday, so he's got to actually make Havdalah after the burial, because he's not allowed to make Havdalah at this point. So, but if that's the scenario, he says, but realize, let's say he didn't know the halacha, and b'di'evet he made Havdalah without consulting with others. So an onein is an osek b'mitzvah. He's engaged in the mitzvah of burial. He's patur from the mitzvah of Havdalah. And not only that, but not only is he patur, but he's not supposed to engage in other mitzvahs. Let's say he went ahead and made Havdalah because he just didn't know the halacha. So de'ein sarach lachzer ulahavdil la'achar kavuras shenis ayin sham. So b'di'evet, since you already made Havdalah, you don't have to make Havdalah a second time. In other words, it's not that you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of Havdalah at all because you weren't supposed to make Havdalah. Once you did it, so then b'di'evet you're yotzei. Harei mevuar, da'af sheyesh lo petur mitam aninus. So you see from here that even though he's an onain and he's patur from the mitzvah of Havdalah, mikol makom im kiyem es ha-mitzvah yatsa yedei chovasa. But nonetheless, if he fulfilled the mitzvah, he still fulfills his obligation. He still fulfills that future obligation that he will have after the burial is over. V'hu hadin v'kol shekain b'dino shel ha-mishnah berurah. And this will certainly be true in the case of the Mishnah Berurah, where a guy who's a shomer goes ahead and eats matzah the night of Pesach. The afshuhu osek b'mitzvah upater min ha-mitzvah ha'acheres, that because he's engaged in one mitzvah, so he's exempt from the other mitzvah. Mikol makom im hiniach harishona v'kiyem hashniya shaper yotzei ba yedei chova. But if you for momentarily went ahead and stepped away from being a shomer and you fulfilled the other mitzvah, even though what you did was incorrect because you're not supposed to forsake the first mitzvah to do the second mitzvah, nonetheless you still fulfilled the second mitzvah. Okay, that's all I wanted us to see, because this shaila of a person who's an onain, what should they do, what should they not do, comes up quite often, and so normally what we tell a person is that you're an onain, and therefore you should not daven, you should not make havdalah, etc. But let's say they go ahead and they hear havdalah from another family member. It would seem that because they've heard havdalah, that they don't have to make havdalah a second time. That's an important principle. And also, there are many times when it's a suffix whether a person qualifies as an onain. Let's say there's another member of the family who's taken the front seat in doing a lot of the preparations. Let's say there's two brothers, and one brother is on with the travel agent to take care and with the Chevra Kadisha and all of the other things that they need to transport the body to Eretz Yisrael. And the other brother is making other calls to family members or whatever it is, but he's not as busy as the other brother. Does he still qualify as an onain or not? So sometimes there are some gray areas when it comes to aninus, and therefore we tell a person, so maybe just listen to someone else make havdalah, and that way you can avoid the whole problem to begin with. Because if you don't make havdalah, there's certain halachic disadvantages of not making havdalah at all. And even though you're an onain and you're exempt from that, but it's better to avoid any questions of doubt. So we would say in such a situation that it's probably best to listen to someone else make havdalah, and that way you remove yourself from any situation of doubt, and also you would exempt yourself from having to make havdalah after the funeral is over. Which the halacha is that any time if you make havdalah after Motzai Shabbos for whatever reason, you couldn't, or you were exempt from making havdalah Saturday night, you just make it during the day with just a cup of wine, but without the besamim and without the candle. Okay, so that's what I wanted you to see.
Right, just very quickly on that, I presume that if the person is an ones and doesn't make havdalah, there's no other way to hear it. He's not prohibited from eating at that point, or is he?
Right, if he's an ones or he's exempt from the mitzvah, he's allowed to eat. It's only that you're not allowed to eat if you're not exempt from the mitzvah. Correct.
Rabbi, another question, just using our example of the, let's say the Pesach Seder, and is there not a hierarchy of importance of mitzvahs where we, for example, Pesach just comes around once a year and we have all these positive mitzvahs to do. So to me, there seems to be a difference between, let's say, looking after Fluffy and looking after an elderly parent's need or another mitzvah. There must be some sort of hierarchy that where things are important. And this idea about, because you're engaged in the first one, like if you're engaged with looking after Fluffy compared to doing all the mitzvahs of Pesach Seder, it seems a little bit strange.
Right. It's an excellent point, Ron, because there are certain mitzvahs that, and not only does it a mitzvah that only comes once a year, but it's a mitzvah that through its non-performance, a person can get kares, which is a very, very, makes it a very, very serious mitzvah saseh. There are very few positive commandments for which the non-performance of it leads to a punishment of kares. Really, the only two are are Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, and bris milah. So eating matzah does not fall under that category, but it's related to that whole idea. So it's a very, very important mitzvah. But the fact of the matter is that if you are legitimately, so the poskim say that you're not allowed to start to do another mitzvah with the knowledge that it'll prevent you from doing a mitzvah overes, a mitzvah whose time is very, very narrow. There's a very narrow window of being able to do that mitzvah. But let's say you find yourself in the position where you have no choice. You found an Aveda, you brought it home. This Aveda requires your constant attention for whatever reason. And in that case, the Torah actually exempts you. It's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, apparently. It's a Mosaic tradition that you're patur if it's a burden to be able to do the other mitzvah. Now, are you allowed to, let's say someone were to bring you some matzah while you're watching this animal, right, who needs constant attention, otherwise it's going to fall into distress or whatever. Are you allowed to eat a piece of matzah while you're taking care of the lost item or while you're doing shmirah? As long as you can fulfill both of them, yes. But if you have to go outside to get the box of matzah, it's going to cause you to, in some way, slack off of this particular mitzvah that you have that has been thrust upon you. So then you're patur from even a fleeting mitzvah whose time will elapse. The Torah basically exempts you.
Yeah. Is there also not the principle that if you're doing a mitzvah, if you're doing a mitzvah and somebody else can do the other mitzvah, that, like you said about the spouse, taking care of things, that again you're exempt? And this is a topic that comes up quite often. If you're sitting and learning Torah, you're allowed to go to. Should you go and daven?
Right.
Well, not when you go daven, but.
The shaila of whether if a person is engaged in Torah study, does he have to interrupt himself in order to daven and things like that? So normally we say that when it comes to a mitzvah that has no maximal amount, right? It's not a mitzvah that was thrust upon you, but it's a mitzvah that is binding upon you at all times and at all places. You don't have a right to exempt yourself from mitzvahs whose time is fleeting, because you're studying Torah. A person is obligated to interrupt his Torah studies in order to fulfill mitzvahs that are time bound, that can only be fulfilled at a certain time. So there's actually something in the Likutim that you mentioned. Something you said you reminded me of this statement. It's at the very beginning, that if you're engaged in the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, you're exempt from other mitzvot. So the Likutim over here says, Aval imhu osek b'Torah, if you're studying Torah and you bring home an Aveda, im efshel mitzvah lehe asot al yedei acherim lo yasik talmudo. If the mitzvah could be done by other people, if there are other members of your household who could look after the lost object, you should not interrupt your studies. V'im lav yaseh ha-mitzvah v'yachzor l'toraso. But if there's no one else available but yourself, so then you should interrupt your studies, do the mitzvah, and then return to your studies as soon as the mitzvah is done. Va'ayin od b'poskim. And he says, I refer you, there's lengthy discussions in the poskim. Yesh Omrim, he also says the b'melamed Torah l'rabim dino ka'osek b'mitzvah ve'eno mafsik. That if you're teaching others, then it's like you're osek b'mitzvah, and if you're in the middle of teaching a shir, you don't have to engage in other mitzvahs. Gam ha'osek b'mitzvah d'Rabbanan patur b'mitzvah d'Oraisa. Similarly, if a person is even just engaged in a rabbinic commandment, but it was thrust upon him, or that this is his normal time that he does this mitzvah, you can exempt yourself even from a biblical commandment. Let me just tell you a very quick story, just to illustrate how you have to use common sense. My Rosh Shiva was Rav Yaakov Weinberg Zatzal. He was the brother of Rav Noach Weinberg. And at his Levaya, which was a number of years ago, his son got up and gave a hesped, gave a eulogy for his father, that when he was 8 or 9 years old, he was in a cheder in a particular place. And the Rebbe was giving shir to these 8 or 9 year old boys. And all of a sudden they started hearing screaming from the building next door. Apparently a fire had broken out in the building next door. There was some kind of mishap, and a woman was screaming for help. And the Rebbe told the boys that they were engaged in the mitzvah of Torah study, so that they didn't have to do anything to help this woman. So he just said, stay in your seats, we're going to continue learning. And in the interim, terrible things happened. He didn't elaborate. And so as a result of that, the little Yaakov Weinberg left the cheder and never came back to that particular cheder, and just went on his own path, because he said that anyone who can interpret the Torah to mean that if someone's life is in danger or someone is in distress, you can exempt yourself from helping them because you're engaged in Torah study, that's not the Torah that I want. So while it's true that a person can exempt themselves in many instances, but you have to also know that when another human being is in distress, of course you have to go and interrupt whatever you're doing, including your Torah study, and that's the epitome of chesed. Is that if you yes, it's possible to exempt yourself from the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda because you're in the midst of Torah study. But if you're there and no one else is available to do it, so then you have to do it. And especially when it comes to Pikuach Nefesh, there is no mitzvah, including Talmud Torah, that is more important than helping save someone's life. And if even there's a suffix whether a person's life is in danger, you have an obligation to assist them and to stop whatever you're doing, no matter how holy your endeavor may be. And this has multiple applications, and it even has applications during COVID, where a person may say that what we're engaged in is so holy, we don't have to worry about protecting other people's lives. This has been a topic of discussion. At what point do we sacrifice communal observances, including tefillah and including Torah study, for the sake of the greater the welfare of the community? And that's also part of the discussion. Okay, comments, questions? All right, so
one quick thing about Torah study timing, unless it's a specific shiur, seems like there's some variability in when you can do it on occasion, not always. I mean, if you have a set shiur, that's when it happens. So by deferring your schedule so that you can still accomplish both, should you try and opt for that?
It depends, because you have to apply a lot of times common sense. A lot of times you can defer and the Torah never gets studied. But there are times when there are really unique situations where, let's say your aging parent has a certain need, they have to be taken to an appointment. So then you certainly have to, stop everything that you're doing and defer your learning for that period of time. And if you need to opt out of a shir because this mitzvah comes up too often, so then but you have to make up that time with going to a different shir at a different time. You just have to sometimes we have to reorganize our schedules based on the other needs of of serving Hashem that take place at a time when we go to a shir. Fortunately, that's why we have YouTube and all these recorded shiurim, so that we can always go back to what we need to study when something else that is quite vital gets in the way.
It's not quite the same, Rabbi, because I just listened to Friday's shir before this so that I could be up to date, because I had to miss it for a particular reason, and it's not the same as being there, that's for sure.
Well, we lose out on having your participation.
Very kind, Rabbi. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you soon.